This morning, we want to estimate, as far as we can, the rise of psychological thought through the great periods that preceded our modern way of life. Actually, our knowledge of the religious and philosophical literature of the world may be said to cover a period of approximately 5,000 years. This does not exhaust the background or historical perspective, but for 5,000 years we have a fairly well organized descent of written tradition. Prior to that time, origins are obscure. Writing gradually disappears into pictoglyphic symbols, and the way of life of man before this era of the written word is dim to us. We have every reason to assume that a powerful cultural tradition existed before the invention of writing. But about this, we do not have very many historical landmarks about which we can speak with authority. But from the beginning of literature, from the beginning of the written word and the hieroglyphical writing, which made possible that man could express his integrated thoughts, we find the descent of the quest for knowledge concerning the interior life of the individual. Ancient man perhaps took more for granted than we do, was less critical, and more completely dominated by observational knowledge. But he was still aware of the tremendous importance of his own internal incentive and initiative power. He was already seeking to understand how he came to be alive. He sought for the mystery of this aliveness in himself and the power by means of which he could be a rational, thinking, self-moving being. In the beginning, naturally, his instincts were essentially religious in this field of research. The many mysteries which he could not solve, he assigned to divine powers. He assumed, therefore, from the beginning, the existence of some kind of a spiritual energy or life principle, either in the form of a personal deity or in the form of natural forces. He also assumed that he shared in these energies and forces and lived because of them, and that in some way they moved from within himself, vitalizing and energizing his conduct. In the beginning, of course, the search for the vital nature of this internal led him into a variety of systems of thinking. And we have the panorama of the world's oldest concepts, rising in the valley of the Euphrates, in Egypt, among the ancient Aryan Hindus, and in China. In these regions, we find at a comparatively ancient time that research and thought were devoted to analyzing the internal constitution of the individual and attempting to classify the various fields of endeavor, the various conditioned reflexes which man exhibited. All this took place long before there were any names or terms for these explorations. And I think we may say that they belong to an era, or a time, or a level, and that this entire level was essentially psychological. For man searching for himself used most of the methodologies that we use today, but he had no clear terms to distinguish them. We know, for example, that in the Egyptian rituals, the mortuary rituals, the soul of man, the psychic principle, emerges as an entity, emerges as a being living within man, a soul in a body. In Egypt and Babylonia and China and India, the search for the immortality of the psychic principle was already well underway. And certainly 5,000 years ago, man was convinced that he was a living being living in a body, that he had an existence apart from this body. And most important in our psychological research, he was convinced that the being in the body was more important than the body. That the service of this being was a supremely significant service, and that the instruction and development of this being within the body, these conditionings were essential to the health of both the being and the body. Man had already begun to integrate a moral code, and a moral code was essentially a psychological code, inasmuch as morality contributed to the comfort of the psychic entity. Man who broke the code, who violated the primitive taboos of his kind and tribe, was unhappy. Therefore, essentially, adjustment and happiness, serenity and security came from obedience to the code. Now, these pleasant reflexes had to do with the pleasure or comfort of the psychic being. It was the person in the body who determined the happiness of that body. And the individual was deeply concerned with the satisfying of instincts and impulses and intuitions within his own nature. Primitive man, perhaps more than modern man, was also concerned with the extrasensory perception band, which transcends the normal functional structure of our thought and emotion. In the beginning, he assumed without question that man's psychic life had an existence of its own, and while it was normally involved in our objective existence, it also was involved in a survival for itself. Thus, the psychic being had a life apart from our physical life. It did not come to the mind of ancient man that this psychic life was completely identical with body. Various explanations were advanced to demonstrate the validity of this claim, but even among the ancient Greeks, prior to any integrated concept of immortality, they definitely believed that the decarnate soul continued to be aware, continued to have kind of life. And throughout the earth are scattered the burial mounds of ancient peoples, both advanced and primitive. And these mounds indicate by their content and by their ritualistic patterns something of the conception that these people held. throughout ancient times, men buried with their dead certain emblems and symbols of continuance. Furthermore, they buried also comforts, commodities, and luxuries, jewelry, adornment, instruments, convinced that these would be of interest or importance to a living soul that survived death. The ancient habit of burying with the dead miniatures of houses and cattle, of various wealths and treasures, and also burying familiar and loved articles. These intimated that ancient man believed that the soul would be in a condition to enjoy these things. The burial of food with the dead also carried the same thought. Furthermore, in his daily life, ancient man left food offerings for the souls of his departed friends and ancestors, by which he implied that these souls could be hungry or could find certain satisfaction in taking the food that was left for them. Most of all, it meant, of course, that these souls continued to live. Otherwise, all such offerings would be meaningless. Thus, from the beginning, this survival of the soul was regarded as a natural assumption. Man, unable to experience the total extinction of himself, could not assume that such an extinction could take place. He must continue. Of course, in the beginning, we had many concepts about the nature of soul and the power which it bestowed upon body. One of these involves the problem of genius. Ancient man tried to explain the exceptional soul, the soul that seemed to have more powers, more abilities, more attributes, a soul capable of an advanced way of life in the culture to which it belonged. Originally, genius, a term which we now regard as signifying an exceptional ability, was a term to define a spiritual being. A genius was a kind of soul existing in space. It was a soul somewhere between divine and human, a soul possessed of extraordinary abilities. To the Greeks, the genius represented a kind of entity that never actually took upon itself a body of its own, but inhabited the minds and emotions of human beings. Socrates prayed that the genius that assisted him might be present in his discourses. And so it was believed that man internally, as a living being, could be nourished or sustained, enlightened or informed by other invisible souls. And when it formed an alliance with a superior being, this alliance resulted in what we call today genius. Genius being the gift of a God to man. By degrees, this problem of the gift of the God passed out of fashion, and we have come to assume that this so-called gift is an innate ability. But we have never yet solved the moral explanation of this innate superiority. The modern psychologist, dominated by materialistic concepts, can only regard what we call genius as an exception or an accident. He cannot explain it rationally, or if he does explain it, this explanation is exceedingly cramped and limited. In the Chinese and Hindu system, the early development of man's belief in a soul, a psychic life, led to the rise of the ritualistic period in religion. Man was searching always for a comfortable soul, a soul that did not hurt, a soul with which he could live in a state of comfort and security. He discovered at a very ancient time that the problems of his living burdened his soul. He found that his soul was saddened by the misfortunes of his life. And also as he turned within himself in time of need for consolation or inspiration, he discovered that these were not always available to him. That in many instances his inner life was weak, inadequate, insecure. That he could not gain from within himself the inspiration and courage for a positive way of conduct. Thus the old situation began to receive attention, that a man could have a soul that was tired, a soul that was sick, a soul that was burdened and weary and disillusioned, and that these difficulties of the soul had to be met in some way. Religion first attempted to meet these difficulties by what we would term release. And this is very largely the pattern that we follow today. For in another age and on a different level, we are recapitulating man's earliest experiments with his psychic life. The search for the soul is a cyclic and periodic quest which arises within cultures at certain degrees of their development. So religion began to bring the soul the satisfaction of psychic drama, psychic glamour. It began to invest life with overtones. It sought to sustain man's conviction of a universal right upon which he could depend. It also set festivals and established rituals, both of rejoicing and of penance, in order that the soul might receive various disciplines from a religious conviction. Man was taught to seek the solace for his soul in the temple, in the sanctuary, in prayer, and also through offerings, and through penances, and through various rites of absolution. These things were to convince him that once he had performed these necessary and regular actions, that his soul would be comfortable again, that peace and internal security would be restored, and that he could face life once more with a good hope. The great festivals periodically gave extraversion to his psychic life. Ancient man probably lived for the most part a rather humdrum existence. He had very few of the continuous stimuli which keep us more or less active. He lived much as the small town person lived 50 or 100 years ago. But by means of festivals, by the great ceremonies and rituals of religion, by the pageantries and holidays of the state, by these various means, the rhythm of man's monotony was broken, and he had periods of extraordinary exhilaration, opportunities to express himself. And all of these essentially were part of a good psychological program. This program gave the individual outlets toward beauty, towards creativity, art, music, drama. And in those days, of course, in primitive ritual, nearly all members of the clan or the tribe participated. It was not a few acting and the rest merely observing. All took part. And in the primitive dance drama of African tribes today, we find the tremendous emotional catharsis that helped these people to withstand psychic stress or pressure, and gave them periodic cycles of relaxation or relief from tension. All of these forms of psychic therapy were apparently instinctively developed to meet the needs which man internally experienced. Gradually, however, man passed beyond this point, and although he preserved these rites and rituals, and they still form part of the heritage of our people, he passed more and more into a philosophic era, a period of search for value. And in this philosophic era, he gained another important dimension. He was taught that there was something he should do besides merely gratifying soul. That this psychic pressure within us should not simply be indulged. That things had to be done to improve the soul itself. Now, there were differences of opinion as to the level of the soul's own entity. But regardless of this, it was taken for granted that that part of the soul which became associated with body became involved in the problems, fears, hopes, and sorrows of body. At least this part had to be reconditioned. The soul had to be recognized as the leader of body. Therefore, the soul had to be capable of wise leadership. It had to be able to discriminate and to unfold its own resources until it was a source of strength to the person, rather than merely contributing to the weakness or delinquency of the conduct of that person. Thus, philosophy began the education of man's soul life. It taught man that it was more important to grow than merely to be happy, that there were duties that were imposed by life, and that the health of the soul depended largely upon its ability to assume responsibility rather than to escape responsibility. That the final maturity of the person was not merely the result of escapism, but was the result of the development of a true, self-responsible adulthood within the person himself. So philosophy began to place regulations upon the conduct of man, seeking to emphasize the improvement of this psychic life. That man was not merely to cater to it, he was to rule it. It was to become an instrument of his own purposes. Here is one of the conflicts, of course, which has never been really solved. Because even today, after several thousand years, we have never been able to convince the individual that he should not cater to his own instincts. We have not been able to teach him that he is supposed to govern his own emotions, that he is supposed to use his mind for the total advancement of himself and his kind, and not merely for the gratification of passing whims. So we have as yet not solved this phase of the ancient problem. But it is only fair to say that antiquity was aware of it and attempted in various ways to circumscribe the excessive attitudes that might burden man's life. It was therefore common in antiquity for the individual to make offerings not only to the souls of the dead, but to the soul within himself. He gradually moved the throne of God into his own internal life. He began to conceive of himself as a spiritual entity, and that as a spiritual entity, he became the servant of an indwelling divine principle. He must reconcile himself with this principle. He must obey it or suffer. Ancient man, observing the disobedience to the laws and codes of his people, brought conscience-stricken remorse, emphasized the importance, therefore, of living according to the code and not violating it. The soul's comfort was so increased. But also there were those who recognized that the code must grow, that you could not bind the individual forever to the past or to some ancient prehistoric way of life. So there had to be leaders, there had to be thinkers, moralists, teachers, religionists, who were able to help the code itself to broaden and deepen and come into greater utility. Men outgrew religions then as they have since, but it was necessary that man should still have religion. So he began to interpret and develop his spiritual traditions, created schools, reformed ancient processes, and kept his faith alive by keeping his spiritual insight as strong and as unfolding as possible. All these problems led in about the second millennium BC to a rising system of soul culture. A soul culture which began to take the place of what we might term a physical perspective, an integration of thinking and believing that took the place of mere observation and reaction to natural stimuli. Thus, in this earlier period, we also begin to see the rising of schools, the rising of systems, essentially dedicated to man's happiness, security, and peace of mind and heart. But naturally, because of these motivations, primarily psychological in their technique. We begin to recognize, for example, the concept of the importance of the individual developing a conscious psychic existence, and the importance of preparing himself for the afterlife, or the world which was to come, by attaining during his physical life a state of soul consciousness. Thus there was a kind of union between the personality and the soul, and the wise were instructed to unite their energies and their resources with their psychic natures. Thus the soul was to become first. The will of the soul and the purpose of the soul were to have authority over the objective life of the individual. He began to really contemplate that his future depended upon his soul. That if he had an afterlife, it was this soul that lived. And he began to conceive as to how he should meet the challenge of the world in which this soul existed. Much of this is developed in the concept of Egyptian philosophy, and also to a measure in the early Aryan schools of India. What kind of a world was the soul going to inhabit after it departed from body? Was the unseen world like the visible one? And to orient his soul, man had to begin to study or to speculate upon the nature of an infinite world beyond this one. He had to begin to variously visualize the structure of the psychic world to which his soul belonged. At one time, in the beginning of course, he assumed that this psychic world was merely an extension of the physical world. It was a better land, but essentially the same land. In the Egyptian thought, of course, the afterlife was a beautiful world called Amentet, or the Elysian Fields. And this was a glorious country watered by a celestial Nile. But unlike the terrestrial Nile, the waters of this heavenly river never failed. There were always crops. Everyone lived well. The poorest man had his own house and his own garden. And if you could earn this state by virtuous life in this world, you came after death into a state of solid comfort that lasted forever. This was a tremendous inducement, but it also indicated the direction of man's psychic thinking. He visualized or envisioned the afterlife as an escape from the restrictions and frustrations of his mortal existence. If he was poor in this world, he would be better off in the next. And of course, each class and group envisioned the salvation and preservation of its own kind, so that as society afterwards was an extension of this society, it would have its kings and its priests and its nobles and its commoners, but they would all be better. They would all be happier. They would all be closer to the gods, and therefore more virtuous. This type of better land continued for a very long while to concern the spiritual thinking of humanity. In fact, it still dominates a very large part of the human race. Although by degrees this better land has been more refined until we are less able to define it in terms of the familiar, but we are still convinced that it is a land of peace and hope and fulfillment, where the sorrows of our present state will no longer be known. This heaven world and the philosophy and theology concerning it dominated Egypt, came into power in China and many other places, and became the moral incentive behind physical conduct. The individual had to earn this better state. This also became a means of explaining his present troubles. These troubles were tests. They were trials to which his soul was subjected. There were so many things that happened in physical life that men could not explain. War, pestilence, drought, all these things, that it could only be assumed that man was being prepared for something. That if he was faithful unto all these daily problems, he would be made master over greater things. So he gained consolation and a certain internal normalcy. He received incentives. Whether they be constructive, we cannot pause to consider now. Perhaps he was influenced by fear of punishment after death. But in any event, to do right, to live a good life, these incentives were justified by his theology. They were important because they brought survival, happiness, contentment to his soul. Man, beginning to study his soul, however, made several other interesting observations about it. He gradually overcame the first blush of his enthusiasm, and he began to consider just what kind of a soul he had. Like St. Paul, he discovered that whenever he would do good, evil was ever nigh unto him. He began to realize that his soul was not a God. It was not perfect. His soul could make mistakes too, at least appear to make mistakes. He could give the best that he had. He could be very loving and sincere and still be in trouble. He also could not depend always upon the leadership of his psychic life because selfishness came in. Ulterior motives moved within himself. And he found very often, looking inward, that there was much conflict. That he was not only aspiring after truth, but he was ambitious for worldly success and power. He learned also that the more emphasis he placed upon worldly success, the more he had to compromise the religious and spiritual codes of living. He learned that he had to make a decision whether he would serve his soul or serve his body. And that this decision had very lasting consequences upon his consciousness. He became aware that to the degree that he was materially successful, he also forgot his soul. And it was not perhaps until his deathbed that he began to reconsider or attempt to reevaluate the significance and dignity of his life. So in the second millennium before the beginning of the Christian era, about 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, man began to make a clear line of distinction between his psychic life and his material life. He said that in the cultivation of his soul, a decision had to be made. That he could not serve two masters. That he could not equally attain in two spheres. That either the body and its desires had to come first, or the soul and its desires had to come first. Something had to be sacrificed. He could not carry water on both shoulders. So in this decision, we had a sort of parting of the ways along the branching of the ancient Pythagorean Y, or the forked road. And those who really earnestly desired the good of the soul began to renounce certain pleasures of the body, certain physical activities, trying to renounce selfishness, arrogance, despotism, seeking therefore to cultivate the soul, perhaps selfishly, but in order that in the great eternity that lay beyond, they would have happiness and peace. It became a truism, an adage, that man's 70 or 80 years in this world should not be allowed to so scar and deform his soul that he could not face eternity with a good hope. So eternity began to take precedence. And in the priestly and learned groups, this condition of the soul often led to a renunciation of worldliness and all worldly concerns. This apparently was all right at a time when man really believed it, really meant it, and gave the fullness of himself to it. However, in the course of time, his faith in the immortality of his own soul began to languish. And when this occurred, his conviction of renunciation was weakened. And instead of giving up the lesser for the greater with a good hope, he began to have reservations. And when this began, his renunciations led to repressions and frustrations because they were not total commitments of himself. But out of this belief that he had a larger life that had to be nourished, came the disciplines for the improvement of the soul. And we have to realize that to the ancients, the emotions and the thoughts were part of the psychic life. So philosophies, arts, sciences began to develop. Man sought learning, not for its own sake, but for the sake of his soul. He believed definitely that he should become the servant of soul power, and that the beginning of this servitude was skill. It was his privilege to release soul through body. In order to do this, he must train body. He must gain the skill and knowledge which would enable him to be the musician, the artist, the sculptor. He had to have training. And this training was always in order that his inner life might have a fuller expression. He then had to decide between service to the soul and to the profit concept. As an artist, he could make money if he would compromise his soul. So everywhere he had to enter into conflict between the true service of the psychic life within him and the advancement of his corporeal condition. He strove constantly, of course, to find some reasonable adjustment between these extremes. And Socrates gave us that adjustment in his concept of moderation. That by doing all things moderately, man maintains a kind of equilibrium within himself, serving both the needs of the soul and the needs of the body, and having a good life in both states. The moment he became immoderate, however, one state was penalized. And in our way of life, it is usually the spiritual state that is more or less compromised. In this time also, there came to man the desire to understand and to even explore the world of the soul. In fact, he had already some experience in this, but he did not know just exactly what he was doing. He found that sleep and the dream state seemed to be a kind of temporary death. Therefore, he gained the conviction that in all possibility, after death, he entered into a kind of life similar to the dream life. When he was dreaming, the dream seemed real. When he awoke, the figment of the dream dissolved. It never occurred to him that the dream state was merely subjective. If he dreamt that he went somewhere, he believed that in his inner life he traveled to that place. But in dreams he found the consolation of a kind of certainty. He became aware of his own soul life. He also experienced in his dreams various symbolic projections of his daily life. Men at that time had a rather regimented life. Therefore, dreams undoubtedly were less complicated and confusing than they are in our way of life. They probably had greater conformity, and persons recounting their experiences found that others had had similar experiences. Thus, the sleep life became the proof of the soul's existence apart from body, and also the proof that man could journey many ways and into different places and come into contact with beings and conditions and circumstances unknown in his material existence. Thus the dream world became the beginning of an internal psychic existence. And from this he gained the conviction that he could, even during life, experience the mysteries of the soul. Also, as time went on, he began to observe that among his own peoples there would arise occasionally an individual who seemed to be particularly gifted or burdened with this psychic power. He gradually also came to realize that this person was nearly always a hypersensitive person. That these dreams and visions came to a kind of human being. A kind often not acceptable materially as an example of the physical activities of a people. These dreamers, these mystics, became the poets. They became a strange order of detached human beings. They were not remembered for their valor as soldiers. They had not the ambition to usurp the powers of kings. They lived a strange, detached life of their own. And from their visions and their accounts, man gained an increasing insight into the psychic life of his kind and species. He also then came to the conclusion that if these kinds of sensitive, detached people had this gift, that others could also cultivate it by following the life patterns of these detached individuals. So the way of mysticism was patterned after the natural way of the born mystic. This born mystic, who lived in a kind of strange inner world, was copied by other men. They began renouncing their worldly goods. They began to act as he did. They tried to reconstruct in themselves the strange detachment which seemed to be the secret of his power. Some succeeded, and they did not know why. Others failed. But they came gradually to the belief that as man weakened his physical bonds, as he placed the body under ever heavier restraint, he had a tendency to have psychical experiences. Thus he had prayer and meditation and long periods of fasting, because in fasting he seemed to weaken the body. And as he weakened the body, he liberated the soul. So our religious story bears upon all of these different phases of man's questing after a spiritual life. There were two ways in which man gradually believed that he could have conscious union with his soul while yet he lived. One of these ways was through growth, through the unfoldment and anticipation of the way of life that was to come after him. Thus, through the extraordinary cultivation of virtues, through the improvement of his faculties and powers, through the life of wisdom, man believed that he could come to a greater and more lasting insight by which he could understand and experience the mysteries of his soul. So he sought by reason and learning to grow up to the soul. He also, however, experienced this other way, the way of complete faith and the rejection of knowledge. He found that the individual who let go of all material things also found himself involved in the psychic mystery. That if he renounced all objective attainment, he will also gain a kind of depth penetration. And that by the renunciation of objectivity, even of thought, strange mystical insights seemed to come to him. He found this particularly true when he surveyed the practices of primitive peoples. He found they had a mysticism without learning, that they had an insight without knowledge, and that this insight was almost completely an abiding faith, an absolute acceptance of life. So there were two ways, apparently, in which you could attain your end. One, by the complete rejection of materiality, the total acceptance of life itself. The other, by a tremendous effort, an effort to become learned, to become wise, and to become informed. And of course, being practical human beings, our ancestors began to look for the bargain. They tried to decide which was the way of greatest attainment with least effort. We have always had that habit in humanity. Out of this struggle there came a rather confusing report. Men mostly took it for granted that the easy way would be the way of the simple relaxation into faith. That the individual will have an easier time giving up what he knew than he would learning something else. Actually, by experience, he found that the two paths were equally arduous, that there was really no difference whatever, and that actually it was often more difficult to unlearn than it was to learn. The individual found that his renunciation of ignorance was as strenuous as his attainment of wisdom. Under the renunciation of ignorance, he was forced to give up all of his own opinions, and this was little short of a tragedy. He found that he could not give up the decisions and attitudes which had become his own. He found that it required a tremendous incentive and a vast amount of internal integration to be able to free himself from the illusions and delusions that held him in the state of ignorance. Therefore, he then turned to wisdom to see if this offered an easier road. He found that it did not. He found that the challenge of wisdom was a continual pressure upon him, that the more he knew, the better he had to act. And the responsibility of living up to knowledge was as heavy as the responsibility of renouncing illusion. It was easy enough to learn. It was not too difficult to become instructed. But every new fact that was learned, every new experience that was understood, challenged the individual. He had to live it. He could not know better than he lived without getting into more trouble. And because wisdom gave him the valid evidence that selfishness was a tragic disaster, he had to come to a decision. So he decided to stop learning because he preferred to remain selfish. It was too much to ask the individual to live according to his light. It is still too much. We have never been able to bridge this interval between the glory of theory and the delinquency of practice. To achieve these ends, however, ancient man struggled with the problem. He did the best he could with what he was and with what he had. And out of the problem itself came another important psychic fact. Man came to the conclusion that the human dilemma was the divine opportunity. He became convinced out of hundreds and thousands of years of struggle that it was largely improbable that the average human being would make the transition successfully. The pressures of worldliness were too great. The inducements of worldliness were too real. Consequently, the salvation of man had to depend upon something stronger than himself. One of the answers, of course, was advanced in the ancient philosophies, namely, that actually and factually the soul, being stronger than the body, could ultimately contribute to the salvation of the body. That once the soul reached a certain degree of integration, the psychic life would put the rest of the personality in order. This was a great and hoped for end. But again, this could only arise after a tremendous amount of achievement. By degrees then, man began to take the ground that this achievement could only be attained generally or broadly or widely through an intercession, through some circumstance that would raise the individual into an experience before he had actually attained the strength to have that experience by himself. In other words, the point was that the only way that the average person could be induced to really make a thorough job of the redemption of his own soul was to have the personal experience of that redemption before he had earned it. This resulted in the establishment of the rituals of the mysteries and of the rites, and of the gradual development of the various messianic codes. In the temple, under the glamour of the initiatory ceremony, under a kind of psychic hypnosis induced by the priests and by the sacred rituals, the candidate had an actual experience of exaltation. He suddenly, temporarily at least, felt the real dignity of his own internal life. He had it as an experience of fact and not something told to him. And in most instances, this experience was of so sublime a nature, so exalting, so tremendous in its implication that it could not be forgotten. And out of the mystical experiences provided for the ancient rituals, it was possible to inspire the human being to labor strenuously to attain a state which he had already fleetingly known, and the sublimity of which he had sensed and accepted. Thus this exaltation of the psychic state, through religion, through the state rituals, and through the ceremonies, became the basis of the initiation system, where it became so powerful and obvious an improvement that the candidate was then willing to accept disciplines and was willing to dedicate his life to the achievement of this thing which he had already come to know. This knowledge was different from the transmission of knowledge by the ordinary methods of teaching. It was a factual sharing in the state to be desired. By the middle, then, of the second millennium, before Christ, we find the rise of the mystery systems. We find them taking over and seeking to attain the health of the soul. And the general theory of these systems was very simple. Namely, that salvation had to be earned, and that man had to earn the conscious release of his own soul. That if he ignored or neglected the soul, or left it unnourished, his after-death state was penalized. He could not pass into the conscious state of bliss or security or everlasting peace. Now then, of course, by this time it had also become rather obvious that there was moving out of this world a continuing stream of souls that had not yet attained to such security. Primitive man seemed to have no solution for this, other than to assume that these souls simply went on in the state they had attained, and perhaps sometime, somewhere, some way, had opportunity for further growth. It was rather dim because man had no actual concept of the relationship between living and growing. But in the philosophic era, it became pretty obvious that the soul of the average person was not going to attain spiritual serenity in the short span of its material existence. Gradually, therefore, in various parts of the world, the teachings of metempsychosis appeared. The cycle of rebirth was introduced as a means of giving the soul renewed opportunity for growth. The end was still the same, but man, becoming a little disillusioned with man, began to realize that human regeneration was a larger undertaking than he had assumed to be the case. Instead of beginning to think of perfecting the human being in 20, 30, or 40 years, began to contemplate the need for several hundred lives to work it out, because folks just didn't perfect as rapidly as might be desired. Growth, actual growth, was a very slow growth. You could give the individual skill, you could inform him, you could enlighten him, you could give him wonderful opportunities of learning and experience, but you could not make him grow. Growth had to come from incentives within himself. And many persons live their entire lifetime without this incentive ever appearing. The individual did not even believe in growth. He saw no reason for it. And those who came under the contact of the schools, who also constituted so small a minority group that it was not possible through them to indoctrinate the whole structure of society. Thus the beginning of the concept that after death was not final. There were, of course, other considerations. Perhaps some few might attain to a great and noble consciousness. Therefore, the invisible universe had to be reorganized and stratified to take care of these varying degrees of growth. We find the emergence of the philosophic system in Egypt, for as early probably as nearly 4,000 years ago, we find the introduction of this deity, Typhon, or the crocodile hog of the Nile, this mysterious monster that swallowed the souls of the dead who were not found worthy in the weighing of the soul in the judgment hall. Those that failed were swallowed up by this strange monster that represented earth. They were brought back again into the material world and reborn. Thus now the path of soul growth began to take shape. Those who attained most were able, therefore, to return to this life best equipped. Those who finally attained emancipation or liberation then departed into a higher state of being and did not return, as in the Buddhist concept of nirvana. So the soul's journey, the soul's need, became organized as the great science of antiquity. And I think we can say definitely that the science of the soul was the dominant theme of the ancient world. Man searching to know and understand these mysteries of life within himself. The soul had to be brought into a state of self-enlightenment, of complete security, and various rituals and devices were created to make this possible. As time went on, then, man, continuing to struggle with this problem of his own soul, began to sense another dimension that had not previously concerned him. And that is the relationship of the soul to God. We had already had a long experience of man working with the soul itself. But what was the soul? Was that the ultimate? Was attainment of identity with soul the final good? In the great golden age of philosophy that began around the 9th century BC and extended on down through most of the following centuries, the problem of the soul's relationship to something superior to its own nature began to be contemplated. Namely, that the soul was not itself the total being, but that the soul was a kind of bridge uniting the objective person with the universal principle of life. Therefore, behind soul was spirit. They were not identical. And as soul inhabited body, so spirit inhabited soul. Man was a triune creature, a spiritual life, a soul entity, and a bodily appearance. these had to be balanced and equated in their own right. Thus, by degrees, soul lost its dominance, the position which it occupied in Egypt, because man became aware that the soul life of the Egyptian, whether in this world or in the Elysian fields, was a continuing kind of separateness, that the Egyptian dead differed only in the condition of body from the Egyptian living, and that you kept on living within the soul as a being somewhere forever. This did not seem to be right either. And out of the studies and developments of the golden age of philosophy and the rise of the great religions which took place between the 5th and 9th centuries BC, man began to seriously consider the essential nature of spirit. And one of his first conclusions was that the primary difference between soul and spirit was that soul was an individual thing and spirit a universal thing. Man's concept of spirit became more and more associated with life, until finally his God concept became the universal life principle. And this universal life contained within it all things that could come from it. So this life became the first and most valid of all things. Man not only had to escape from body, but some way he had to escape from soul. Now, how does it happen that man discovered the need for this escape from soul? Perhaps the reason why he felt this need was that up to this point he was burdened constantly with this dual problem of becoming more wise or becoming less ignorant. When all ignorance ceased or all wisdom was attained, what then happened? Man began to dream beyond this. He began to realize that there could be no satisfaction merely in wisdom. He began to find the whole concept of his soul life important but not complete. And here we come to one of the problems that faces us today. In the last 50 years, we have had the greatest rise in psychological thinking that modern man has experienced. Gradually, by recapitulation, we have moved again into approximately the condition of man in the 15th century BC. We have got him to the point now where the soul is beginning to be believed in psychology. We are shifting the responsibility for the bodily activity, for moral decision, for ethical decision, from the objective activity and incidental function of the brain and the nervous system, and we are moving it into the psychic field. We have therefore retired responsibility from one system of man's structure to another. But we get back here now with a soul on our hands. And we find that a soul is just as difficult to handle as the body was. Perhaps a little more difficult, because we haven't enough landmarks. We find that the psychological effort at therapy is not sufficient and is not complete because it becomes too much involved in technique. We are approaching the organization of a science of the soul. But man is a scientist only by superficial allegiance. No human being is psychically a scientist. He is a scientist only because science is a method of attaining knowledge. As soon as he attains it, there is no longer any reason for science. Scientific approach, therefore, is again only a bridge from a state of ignorance to a state of lesser ignorance. This is not the solution. So today we have put a ceiling on the invisible life of man. We have placed a kind of hat on his soul, saying beyond this we may not go. We can trace backward now to the person in the body, and there we leave him. We do not realize that the person in the body is in just as much of a dilemma as the man in the world. The person in the body can solve certain things, but this same person is subject to certain other things, which we have not yet solved and for which we have no explanation. That man believes in the reality of his own soul is not the final belief necessary to attain health and happiness. Unless the soul in turn is integrated in a larger pattern of things, man still remains on the horns of an old dilemma. Therefore, the elevation of the psychic life has resulted in a psychological code now catering to the soul. But the soul being catered to is not becoming less neurotic. The more we cater to it, the more we try to relieve it of its frustrations and pressures, the less lawful our own life becomes. We have attempted in this way to evade the importance of discipline. It is useless to say that the soul does not need discipline. It does. And to try to relieve pressure by allowing the psychic impulses to do exactly as they please has not proven successful. The reason being that the psychic impulses themselves are not sufficiently educated, and the individual has made no effort to educate them. The soul, therefore, is in a fragile condition. And the ancient found that out when he went through the same cycle of recapitulation long ago. He discovered that the soul was only another kind of person, and that it wasn't person but principle that had to solve the mystery. So beyond the person, the soul person, he had to place the divine principle. He had to find out the relationship between his psychic life and a universal good greater than the soul. He could make the mind and emotions servants of the soul, but then the soul became the autocrat and took over the egoisms of the mind and emotion. It was therefore necessary in turn to bind the soul to a still greater allegiance. And the soul had to be bound to the allegiance of consciousness, or spirit, or pure life. The ancient therefore regarded the soul as a useful instrument that could help man to escape from body, but that in the end the soul also had to be faced like the famous Minotaur in the labyrinth. Man who had to overcome his own body must sometime face the need of overcoming his own soul. He can't do this as long as he believes that the soul is the supreme part of himself. And he is being indoctrinated in this by material psychology day after day. And because of this, of course, a large part of psychological technique is ineffective, because it does not go directly to the source of things. It is not final that the soul, which is liberated from frustration, will be good. The soul must be placed under the responsibility of principles. The free soul, the undisciplined soul, is simply a subtle form of an undisciplined personality. the individual can be in trouble with it forever. The soul must also have its allegiance. It must be bound to universal reality. The soul should give man the incentive to obey those great universal causes which the soul can apperceive more clearly than the body. Thus the duty of the soul is to help man to find truth. The soul itself is not truth. The soul itself is not the end. It is only a better means to the end. And as long as it is envisioned as the end, the moral life of man must suffer. Against this, the last time the cycle came round, we had the rise of the great systems of world religion. The purpose of these religions was to emphasize, as it says in the Bible, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. That the soul is not the secret of our immortality. That it is not here that the answer actually lies. It is true that the undisciplined soul corrupts the body. It is also true that the disciplined soul organizes and integrates the body. But neither soul nor body completes itself until both are dedicated to the revelation of consciousness. That it is only through the release of the divine part that the soul and body come into their true inheritance. Thus there is in man something that is deeper than soul, deeper than the mental emotional complex which we call the psychic entity. Buddha pointed this out and warned that the mental emotional life of man, if undisciplined, would ultimately cause a greater catastrophe than ignorance. That it was only when the individual realized that his final allegiance is to the divine plan itself, that he is actually on the way to true liberation. That it is only in the renunciation of both mental and emotional opinion that the person becomes capable of the experience of universal law. Therefore, in the Buddhistic psychology, the individual is taught to gradually liberate himself from the sensory field, which is the psychic field of modern thinking. It is not through the mere gratification, nor is it through merely the release of frustration that man comes into his own. It is through the powerful directing of his total knowledge, his total life, his total understanding toward the integration of his relationship between the individual and the universal. On the ground, therefore, that behind the psychic life of man is consciousness, and that consciousness itself is using the psychic organism as the soul uses the body, then this body, which must give way to the soul, sets the example of the soul giving way to consciousness. How is this to be accomplished? Most of the great religions have said that the answer to this lies in the detachment by means of which the pressure of the psychic life is reduced. The soul must not be merely an instrument of perpetual gratification. It must be taught to relax. It must be brought into a moderation in which its own natural propensities cease extraordinary or unreasonable function. Therefore, peace must come to the soul. And this peace must be in the relaxation of the soul. Just as man will never find satisfaction through gratification alone, so the soul never finds satisfaction through the fulfillment of its own purpose. It finds satisfaction only in being the instrument of a greater purpose. And everywhere in the world, the individual who works for himself is less fortunate than the individual who works for all. So the individual initiatives, the individual selfishness which can be in the soul must gradually be remedied, must be re-educated, and must be idealized. The ancients regarding the soul as the seat of certain great powers, of which the love of beauty, harmony, order, peace, sublimity, these moods belong to the soul's nature and field. Therefore, by the cultivation of the pure principles of the great creative arts, man purges his soul of a certain gross part. It also helps the soul to be nourished, for the soul must be nourished by the nobility of life, and it must therefore be taught and by example inspired to instinctively assert itself for the attainment of the greater good in every situation that arises. Soul must never be merely a means of gratifying body. It was therefore held by Socrates and many others that the individual who gradually reorganized and reintegrated his emotions and thoughts gradually took pressure off of the soul. And that the only way in which we can actually cure ourselves of our neuroses and frustrations is not by the catharsis alone, although this may help in an emergency. We are not better because we get rid of our inhibitions. We are more comfortable temporarily. But the cure lies, however, in a way of life which does not cause inhibitions. The individual who extroverts his frustration is comfortable for the moment. But the great solution lies in rescuing the emotional mental life from the errors which cause frustration. Thus, to get out of all psychic difficulty, we must go back to universal law. And this universal law resides in the divine consciousness which sustains all things. Consciousness must then have its victory over mental, emotional structure, whether this be psychic or physical. If we achieve this victory, we then attack the root or cause of problem, and problem itself is finally overcome. The answer then to the ancient man was that the soul must be brought into a state of health, and that this state of health is never attained by catering to the soul, but by bringing the soul face to face with responsibility and assisting the soul to carry it with a full spirit of graciousness. As soon as injustice and all the negative suspicions arising from ignorance are overcome, most of the false pressures of the soul are neutralized. The individual who is not possessive is therefore not going to cause these intensities of psychic reaction which require therapy. By gradually changing the source, the substance and root of man's way, the psychic life comes into integration. And when it is properly and naturally integrated, so that it is at peace, is at rest, and is dedicated to the service of those values which are real, in this state the ancient maintained that consciousness or pure life began to move through soul into manifestation. And in that way man came finally into a direct relation to the ultimate cause of things. and taking his stand firmly upon eternal principles, then have the remedy for all defects arising from ignorance or from the misuse of energies and powers. Little by little, therefore, the great good was attained. And man continued down into other generations working with his psychic problem. Each step of the way was accompanied by devices aimed and intended to assist the individual in gaining control of the excesses by means of which his psychic life could be deformed. Coming then to the present day, what is the essential fact or factor we have more or less discovered? I would think that it would have to do with our present attitude toward psychic integration. Today we are thinking of psychic integration as an end. That the individual, if he can be adjusted to society so that he can get along with himself and others, he has achieved. This is it. Actually, this is not it. Because adjustment of any kind is an adjustment for a moment only. And the psychologist can work with the individual and get him in a complete adjustment with the problem. But by the time the therapy is finished, the problem is historical. It is no longer factual. Because yesterday is history. Only today is alive. Therefore, the individual being adjusted to a problem moves inevitably away from both that problem and that adjustment. And we have to start all over again. The individual, cleansed of one complex, falls into another the next day. Because actually, we are working on a mechanical situation, failing to understand totally the real reason for the trouble. Modern man is captured in this dilemma. He has no way of getting out of it because he has gradually undermined his idealism and his ethics to the point that he has no clear concept of spiritual value toward which he can turn in his emergency. He therefore follows a line of least resistance. He believes that the individual can be cured merely by excess, that he can extrovert sufficiently to get rid of the frustration, and then he will be all right. This may give him a temporary breather, and will, but like aspirin tablets, is not the solution. The solution lies in the reduction of the circumstance or the factor that keeps pressure rising continuously. And for the answer to this, we cannot look entirely in the contemporary field. We have to go back to a previous cycle when the problem was approached and handled with effectiveness. We cannot solve the psychological problem of man without a powerful idealistic concept, either in the highest brackets of philosophy or in the highest brackets of religion. We cannot solve man without taking the spiritual factor into consideration. And the more consistently we deny it, the sicker man becomes. There is no way in which we can ever take from him what the modern would call his superstition, because his superstition is his life. And without this life principle moving behind him and sustaining him in every step of his growth, the individual cannot be induced into a way of life which will correct his psychotherapeutic problem. There is no release from a psychosis except to rise above it. And we have no place to rise above it as long as materialism sits upon the top of the psychological program and says, beyond this you shall not go. So the individual must choose for himself to realize that psychic organization arises also from a spiritual conviction, and that the individual dedicated to the natural, gentle, kindly service of a universal principle of good, that is the individual who is going to recover. And beyond and above all other adjustments, philosophy and science are valuable only to the degree that they give us a solid conviction upon which to build a living faith that can have victory over the faults and the ignorance of our mind and emotions. This is a pattern which the ancients learned, have handed down to us out of their own experimentation. And it looks as though we have come very close to the time when we recognize the inevitable psychic need of this pattern. For in the midst of our psychological materialism, we are having the greatest restoration of faiths that the world has seen in many hundreds of years. Man instinctively is seeking the autocorrective mechanism. And the only autocorrection for his present problem is a deep, beautiful faith inspiring him to live well. Time's up. Now, I was asked a few days ago to write a few lines on the problem, is each individual born with a purpose? The individual who asked for these few lines was in a rather desperate mood at the moment. They just wanted to really believe that there was some reason for existing. So, is it true that each person born with a rather different integration of himself is born with the peculiar ability to do a certain thing better than perhaps any other person could do it? Or at least better than those with whom he will come in contact are likely to do it? And that each person has a different allotment of abilities which can make him a unique person, making a unique contribution to the survival of collective society. We want to take that as a consideration for next Sunday morning. I'd like to also call to your attention our various books and publications. The new issue of Horizon is on the table. Our book, Old Testament Wisdom, can be examined and secured off of our book table. You will find a number of our writings dealing with these problems that we discussed this morning. Perhaps our book, Self-Unfoldment, would be of particular help on this occasion. Let me also call to your attention that our society offers what we regard to be an enlightened approach to counseling and problems. And if you are concerned with problems or idealistic counseling that places a spiritual factor at the root of life, you can ask for a small brochure that describes our facilities. We also want to remind you that Christmas is coming, and if you will do some of your shopping at our book table, it will help us and save you, we feel, considerable time and energy. We also like to point out that our Christmas publications, our booklets, are suitable gifts, small gifts or nice cards for your friends. If you can help us through doing part of your shopping with us, it will enable us to continue the work that we are doing. So we thank you very kindly and hope to see you with us next week.